Good evening, I'm Cathy Lewis. Johns Hopkins, the famed medical school in Baltimore, used to have a policy that its physicians had to retire by age 65. The story of Georgeanna and Howard Jones, two doctors who were governed by that policy, may have been what convinced them that that policy needed another look. Because when the Joneses retired from Johns Hopkins, they set up shop down the road at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. And one wonders whether they had the television on in the Johns Hopkins boardroom that day nearly 30 years ago when Elizabeth Carr was born and the Jones became the first American doctors to deliver a baby conceived through in-vitro fertilization. Dr. Georgeanna Jones died in 2005, and Dr. Howard Jones still works every day. On his agenda this day, a conversation with us. Welcome back, Dr. Jones. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I tell you, that story about the mandatory retirement age just cracks me up. I think they must have just sort of hung their heads and thought about that a time or two.
Well, that was generally true of most academic institutions, and I think most of them have given it up now.
Yeah. Well, you celebrate your 100th birthday this coming December.
That's correct.
And so this month has been a lot about fetes and galas and parties and celebrations, not just here, but really all over the country. So how does this 100th birthday feel to you? Any different than the other 99?
Well, I'm certainly glad to be here, that's for sure.
There is that.
I don't know that I have any special feeling about that, and I just wonder whether it's really true or not.
Well, December 30th.
And I hope I live through it all.
I'm confident you will. So December 30th is the big day coming
That's correct.
up. That's fantastic. Well, happy birthday. Happy birthday indeed. What a remarkable series of developments happened since 1981, and look at where this in vitro fertilization process is now and how much it's influenced the world in which we live. There are clinics now all over the country. That must be very gratifying.
Well, it is indeed to know that it has taken on and is available throughout the world. It's interesting, though, that the United States is behind the rest of the developed world in its usage.
Really?
For instance, in the United States, about 1% of the newborns are a result of IVF. But in other countries, and particularly Europe, it's much higher. In Denmark, for example, I was looking at the figures the other day. In 2007, 5% of the babies there were due to IVF. So we have a little way to go in terms of usage on a population basis.
So to what do you attribute that?
Well, in Europe, I think the explanation is that IVF is generally covered by the health insurance of the country. That may not be the entire reason, but I think that's a major portion. And of course, that's not so in the United States.
Yes. That's an interesting point. You know, we've had having this raucous healthcare debate for a couple of years now. I wonder, as a physician and looking at the healthcare bill that was eventually passed, just the broad strokes of it, how do you feel about it?
Well, my problem is I don't really know enough about the details of the bill. I do know that I did make a modest effort to get some of the politicians interested in IVF, but it didn't seem to strike a happy note. Perhaps the reason for that is that where IVF is covered by insurance, it accounts for less than 1% of the total insurance claims. So it is not real high on the radar screen of anybody as an important segment of health. Although, as far as the people themselves are concerned, of course, it's a major issue.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, you know, it's interesting, too, to think about the fact that back in '81, or back in the mid-'80s, I suppose, you were invited to the Vatican to talk about the sort of the ethical and religious implications of all this. And I guess I wonder if that may not play a role in the difference in rates, too, overseas.
I'm not sure about that. And it's interesting that some time ago we polled our patients on their religious preference, and it turned out that the number of Roman Catholics was equal to the population, so that the official status of the Catholic Church, I'm not sure at the parish level, has really had all that influence. Indeed, a very good friend of mine, the late Dick McCormick, who was a Jesuit priest and professor at Notre Dame, always said that there may be a little difference in the doctrine at the parish level as compared with the magisterium.
Yeah.
And so I think that plays a role here.
That probably wouldn't be the first time that happened either.
I think that's true. Right.
You know, I wonder, as we think about some of these larger issues that are occasioned by a conversation about in vitro fertilization, certainly science has brought us to this place in which we're talking about stem cells, although depending on the outcome of some of these court cases, there may be some big news around that. I wonder, at a fundamental level, all of these questions seem to get back to this idea, and we were talking about this just before we started the program, about where life begins. It's a big question and a pretty important one.
It's a basic issue, and indeed one that we discussed in the Vatican, of course. But in the United States, as far as the law is concerned, the Supreme Court has considered this question, and in Roe v. Wade, they decided that as far as the United States was concerned, societal protection for the developing conceptus would begin with viability, which is much later in life. However, there still persist many people who believe, and it's a belief, that life should be protected much earlier. It's a long discussion. We could spend a couple of hours on this issue. And indeed, it is at the basis of many of the decisions we have to make in reproductive medicine.
Yeah.
And we need to understand the patient's view about this for things that we do. But you mentioned that there's a court case recently which deals with this particular issue, because in the budgetary dealings with the United States, there's been a law, the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which says that no federal funds can be used at the creation of life if the experiment or the dealings destroys that life. This therefore rules out using embryos for stem cells, for instance. And that is the particular issue that is in the courts at the present time.
And right now, there was an injunction put on those funds being expended for that, and then they've got to stay on that injunction, and I guess they're now trying to figure out what to do with that.
The court held that the Dickey-Wicker Amendment applied,
yes,
and that there was a violation of that by the presidential rulings allowing federal funds to be used for stem cell research. So if that is upheld, and I suspect it's going to go to the Supreme Court, but it'll take a long time to do that. If that should be upheld, that would really do away with most stem cell investigations.
And many scientists and attorneys think it would actually, as you say, most of them, even the Bush lines that were developed and approved some years ago, so it would take it back beyond that, which would be a pretty stunning development in this country, no question about it. So we'll continue to watch that, but it is interesting to watch as well how the doctors and the scientists and the funders are trying to figure out what they can do in this interim period before one supposes it will go to the Supreme Court to try to. It's very interesting to watch the strategies. We get as much out there as we can, and in hopes that in hopes that the ruling comes in our favor, or if it doesn't, then we'll have some stuff out there already, some research out there already. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that one. This question, though, about where life begins, I'm just so intrigued by that, because in our current culture, it's very hard to have a difficult conversation like that, or I'll say a conversation about which there may be diverse opinion, in a culture that seems so dominated by such polarized conversation. It makes it really hard to talk about something this critical and this important.
I think that's right. I also think you need to have a definition of terms so that everybody knows what we're really talking about. It simplifies it for me if we talk about when during development society says that life should be protected. That's
different than a scientific definition.
Well, right? I'm not sure, but when you say when does life begin, but what do you mean by that? What kind of life? I mean, the sperm and the egg are alive. That's life. So we're talking about when does an individual life begin, a person, and I think the clearest way for me, as I said, was to define that as meaning, when does society offer protection to that developing life? And as I said, the Supreme Court held a number of years ago that society really doesn't protect the individual until viability. That is, the ability of the individual to exist without maternal blood. And I think through the ages, you know, people have tried to pick other things, when you could hear the heartbeat, or when there was movement, or something like that. And of course, other people make the view that when the sperm meets the egg, it should be the time. Indeed, there's one country, Costa Rica, that has it in the Constitution that life begins with the joining of the egg and the sperm. So there are various points of view about that, but I think we must emphasize that they are points of view, and that it would be very difficult to prove any of these scientifically, although it appeals to me that the Supreme Court had it about right. If you're looking for a major event during development, a major event during development, I can't think of anything more major than being able to exist without dependence on somebody else. And so for me, the Supreme Court got it right.
That viability question is interesting because as science has progressed, and you know this as well, babies are surviving younger and younger and younger.
Yes.
But when you say viability, I wonder how that affects that.
Well, you raise a very important point, because viability with help has been made lower and lower and lower. And this itself is a debatable point, because there is a point where if you do something to make the individual survive, they survive as a handicapped individual. So you have to be very careful about this issue. And we could spend a long time talking about this.
That one too.
You'd get lots of points of view about that. But as I said, this is a key point in many of the discussions that we have about reproductive medicine, and it's always something that we discuss in-house.
It's I like to think of myself as a hopeful person generally, but I have to say, on this subject of sort of national conversations about important things, sometimes I get a little pessimistic when I see this conversation that takes place on the polarities of issues, because it seems to me...
Because they avoid the issue.
Yes.
Yeah, they avoid the issue as being something that is, I don't know why it's avoided, but it is.
Because it's pretty easy to talk about. I mean, I'm finding that experience with you anyway, that we're having a reasonable conversation about it. Maybe we would have a different opinion about it, but at least you could have, it seems to me you can't get much of anywhere until you can at least sit down and have a conversation about it.
I would agree with that, and I think we ought to talk about it more.
Well, let's start doing that. Good plan. So when you say that you talk about this in-house all the time, that would be just one of probably many series of ethical issues that are occasioned not just by this technology, but really by so much of medicine. It seems there are ethical issues abounding in all of it.
Yes, but we have a formal ethics seminar from time to time to be sure that all the staff is prepared to discuss these things and understand patients' points of view. That's particularly... Recently there's been a development that disturbs me along the lines we're talking about, and that is that by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, it's possible to eliminate some concepti which have the potential to have a serious genetic problem. However, there are groups that will offer these frozen, possibly defective embryos. I call them defective because they have the potential of causing, for people to have implanted in their uterus on the theory that all of these handicapped concepti deserve an opportunity for life. And I got a pamphlet just a couple days ago offering this, and this has been an issue that we have faced from time to time. I personally think that this is inappropriate to possibly perpetuate something which would be, in the end, abnormal and handicapped. But there are other people, obviously, who think the different because they offer these available. And if all you have to do is go to the web, and you can see opportunities for this.
And so, to what degree do the donors have a say or an opinion about the fate of their own genetic materials?
Well, the donor certainly would have the option of deciding what to do with the individual. Then this means that the donors...
So they could decide that would be all right?
Yeah, they decided that would be all right, yes.
Very interesting.
Perhaps avoiding, it avoids a decision on their part.
Yes, I see that. Yeah.
Yes.
And that is something that parents who pursue IVF have to consider, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that is something to consider.
Absolutely.
I know you're also concerned, and I think you've even been doing some work around this, around the idea of implantation of multiple concepti. That's a new term for me. I'm going to start using that.
Right.
And that you really have been focused on how we might achieve the implantation of one,
yes,
so that you wouldn't have these issues.
Well, one of the complications of IVF has been the multiple pregnancy problem. And the extreme example of that, of course, is the octuplet situation. Most twins and triplets, fortunately, are quite normal. But there's no doubt about the fact that as you get multiples, the higher you get, the greater the opportunity is to have an handicapped child. And therefore, in the best of worlds, we would come back to a single embryo transfer. The difficulty is, at the moment, there is no easy method to identify which of the 3 or 4 developed fertilized eggs you have in front of you, which of those is the one that has the pregnancy potential. You know, human reproduction is very inefficient on an egg-to-egg basis. You wouldn't believe that with all the people around. But the fact is that when the sperm meets the egg, normally I'm talking about, there's only about 1 in a chance for 4 that you're going to get a genetic combination that has pregnancy potential. The rest are discarded by nature. That
even has potential.
That even has a potential. The rest of them are discarded by nature. So it's normal for the abnormal to develop, if you understand what I'm saying. So that, you know, medicine is sort of anti-Darwinian in a sense, because we strive to do the best we can to help the unfit. But here we have an opportunity, if we could just identify that egg with the pregnancy potential to be helping Darwin, we would then have this fittest survive, and we would not bring handicapped people into the world. And I think civilization has come to the point where we really must be more interested in the quality of our children by eliminating, I'm not talking about designer babies now, I'm talking about eliminating children who have genetic handicaps when we have the potential to do that. And I think that's going to be more and more developed as time goes along in the near future. And
what you've just said, as I'm sure you know, is pretty controversial in the sense of...
no doubt about it. Sure.
You know, parents who would say, I have a child with a handicap, and she or he is marvelous. And
absolutely. I understand that, and I regret to say that I think people in that particular situation maybe are not qualified to make a judgment that is uninfluenced by their own situation. And I think it's wonderful that people with handicapped children are enhanced or have their life enhanced by this situation. But as I sit back and look at that, I would wish it would be otherwise.
You know, I wonder too, you mentioned the woman with eight babies out in California on top of that. I think she had 2 or 3 others at home. At the moment, I think the doctor in that case, there's a possibility he will be brought up on some charges for having implanted so many. I wonder what your your take on that?
Well, the difficulty is that he didn't break any law. There's no law that prevents you from doing that. There are guidelines, but the guidelines do not have the effect of law. And I suspect that the delay in handling that case revolves around that particular point.
So do you think there should be something stronger than guidelines, or does that hamper the process?
Well, you know, many countries have laws in this regard, and they talk about getting rid of the laws because it's a very controversial issue, and I would hesitate to make a snap judgment about whether I think a law ought to be in place about that. Generally speaking, I think the fewer laws we have, the better.
You kind of hope that somebody could have looked at that and seen that maybe 8 babies for that situation was probably not a good idea, right? You would hope somebody could have come to that conclusion.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, well, this is a controversial issue. I believe guidelines would be great, but I don't think there's any way to prosecute a person except what he has had. He's been expelled from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. He's been excommunicated. That's the only thing that the society could do. But from a legal point of view, I think there's going to be trouble finding the case.
I tell you, we could talk for another hour or so, and I wish we had that much time, because there's so much that's interesting in the field of medicine to talk about, particularly from an ethical perspective. But I just can't let the half hour go completely by without celebrating the work of your partner in all of this, Dr. Georgeanna Jones.
Oh, yes.
And of course she's no longer with us. But I wonder, in some respects, I read an article where your son was interviewed, and he said he thinks you talk to her every day in some way.
Well, sometimes people ask me, what do you think is the most important thing you've ever done in your life? And I have no trouble answering that question. The most important thing I ever did was to persuade Georgeanna to marry me. And because it was a wonderful experience. We had not only a love affair, but a partnership in our work. And she was a delight to be with under all circumstances. So what more can I say?
Yeah, that'll do. The book is War and Love. It's a wonderful collection that's been written about, that you wrote, about the correspondence that you two had during the war years, during World War II. And it really is the most marvelous thing. What I particularly appreciate is the letters that Dr. Georgeanna wrote about the challenges that she faced on the home front.
Oh, yes.
Raising children. And I'll tell you something, I think any wife or husband, either one, of a deployed person could so identify, with the unpredictable nature of what goes on the home front during that period of time.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about as we wrap up has to do with the war in general, because you were a battle surgeon in World War II. And we talked a little bit before we went on the air about the fact that the injuries that are coming out of these wars are very similar to what you saw. But I think you really helped me understand something, so I hope maybe we can recreate a little bit of that. Because I had said to you, it was very frustrating to see how the Pentagon and the Veterans Department, Veteran Affairs, did not do a better job of anticipating what kinds of injuries would have come out of this and what the needs would be for these veterans. And you said, really, this is the chronic nature of war in some respects.
Absolutely. Not only at the medical area, but in the operational area, too. And I think an example of that, in Normandy, for example, we had hedgerows, but none of the equipment that we had, tanks or trucks or anything else, had the ability to go through the hedgerows. So that had to be improvised in Normandy. Now, you would have thought somebody would figure that out ahead of time. But that's just an example of the fact that war is so darn unpredictable, and at the medical area that's absolutely the case, because we had situations which were not described elsewhere, at least we weren't aware of them if they did, and we had to improvise. And as I've said on other occasions, I didn't think about it as I went through life, but recently it has occurred to me that necessity to improvise in Normandy in Germany may have helped me later in life when I came upon situations that needed some improvisation. And I was therefore able to do it, unconsciously benefiting by my experience in the war.
Dr. Jones, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Hope we get you back before your 101st. I will look forward to that. Good. Because we've had 2 half hours now, and I think we've barely scratched the surface. So I look forward to 101.
Thank you very so much.
In a sure sign that time marches on, the first in vitro baby in America is now a mother herself. Elizabeth Carr, a journalist now for the Boston Globe, gave birth to a baby boy in August. Now known as Elizabeth Como, she knew people would write about her birth. After all, PBS cameras were in the delivery room when she was born, so she decided to do it herself. She still keeps in close touch with Dr. Howard Jones and considers him more of a grandfather than a doctor. In fact, it was one of Dr. Jones' English colleagues, a scientist named Robert Edwards, who won the Nobel Prize last week for his work pioneering in vitro fertilization that led to the birth of the world's first in vitro baby in Britain. But it was Drs. Howard and Georgeanna Jones who, despite considerable opposition, moved the science out of the lab and into the homes of American parents. And that miracle has happened 250,000 times across the country since that remarkable day, December 28, 1981, 2 days before Howard Jones's 71st birthday. 2 days before his 100th birthday, he'll be honored at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine's annual meeting. And he also says, by the way, that he isn't buying many green bananas these days. Thanks again for watching. I'm Cathy Lewis, and we'll see you next time for another look at what matters.